and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Inquiry Live. Welcome to November, where it is dark outside nice and early. And tonight we are going to be talking about assessment. In fact, what I've set up for the whole month of November is to talk about assessment tools and what they practically look like. So taking some of the theory of assessment and looking at what it actually looks like inside the classroom, especially when you're looking at using more student voice and choice, as well as inquiry, what that actually means when it comes down to assessment. So to start that off, what I wanted to do was to talk specifically about the triangulation of data and the differentiation in terms of how we are assessing students. I want to start to keep these videos a bit more brief so that we can look at smaller pieces of information in a little bit smaller chunks. So that's my goal for today. So thank you so much for joining us. It's my hope that you've probably heard about the phrase triangulation of data and that you kind of get it in theory, but maybe you're wondering how that actually looks in your classroom. So I'm going to share with you what I do to gather and collect evidence from those three different areas of data collection. So if you are brand new to the show, or this is the first time you're meeting me, my name is Patty. I am a junior teacher here in Ontario, Canada, and I come live every single Monday night to talk about using inquiry-based teaching practices in your classroom in all different subject areas and how that is embedded in all pieces of teaching and using universal design and all of those kinds of things. So thank you so much for joining me. I'm also the teacher behind madlylearning.com, and you can check out all of the other information and resources that are there on that website if you're interested. So thank you so much for joining me tonight. And if you're new, please, or if you've watched a couple of episodes, please feel free to drop a comment and say hello and introduce yourself so that I can see who is watching tonight. So thank you again. So again, we're going to talk about the triangulation of data. So let's get started with looking at what exactly is the triangulation of data. Well, it is collecting assessment information, both the assessment for and assessment of learning, in three different areas, and that is through observations, conversations, and the products that students produce. So we want to make sure that we're going beyond the traditional. So creating pieces of work that you are going to assess for students that are the products they create is probably the most traditional form of assessment that we all experienced as students and that we're probably the most familiar with as teachers ourselves. And that's where we are assigning a task to students. Often it is a pencil and paper type task. We're giving it to students, they do it, we collect it, and we mark it then on our own time. However, we all know that there is a variety of students and their needs in our classroom, and not every single student in our room is going to be able to perform and share their knowledge to the best of their ability through written form. We also want to be able to validate that assessment type by using and making sure that the other forms of assessment can validate that product as well. So we've got to kind of look at all three of the pieces. So the first one is looking at products, and this is the traditional one that you're looking at. The other two are both through observations and conversations. Now, the biggest barrier to assessing with observations and conversations is the fact that a lot of that assessment happens in the moment while you're in the room teaching students, which is different from products because when you're assessing products, you can often take them home with you, use a rubric, quickly mark them on your own time or at home while you're watching TV, and that's a little bit different. So observations and conversations are happening live and in person right in your classroom for most of the assessment. And that's where it's a bit of a barrier because we all know that as teachers, we are super busy and there is a million things happening at a time. So how are we supposed to be assessing students while there is lots of things happening. So I'm going to share with you what those are. So specifically looking at observations. When you're doing assessment, observations are the things that you are seeing. Now, we are observing things all of the time in our classroom, and we're often making snap judgments and deciding what our students need next constantly based on the observations. So we're doing this all the time as teachers. The key for using this as assessment purposes is finding a way to actually record our observations of student learning as they're doing it. So this is a great tool to use as assessment for learning, and actually tracking this over a longer period of time adds some validity to understanding that we should be able to predict if a student does a test, how well they'd be able to do based on some of the observations that we've been making all the way along through the learning process. Secondly, the other piece for the triangulation of data, where we've got observations and products, the third one is conversations. I mean, we should probably be talking to our students at some point in time. We should have conversations with our students. And this is another great opportunity to really quickly assess what their learning is. Now, typically a conversation would happen in a one-to-one or a small group environment, which is why we spent the month of October talking about establishing and running small group instruction in your classroom, because it is a great opportunity for you to be able to have those conversations with students and use those conversations as assessment pieces as you are collecting data on your students. So you want to have conversations with your students either one-on-one, in a small group, or even in a whole group activity. But again, we need ways to track the data on that. So those are the three components of the triangulation of data. You have observations, conversations, and products. And that's what students are producing and that you can actually see. It's what parents really like to see as well, but we have to remember to have a balance of all three of those pieces. So how do I use that in my classroom to make sure that I can actually practically capture the observations, conversations, and products? Well, products is pretty usual for me because they are still doing things on pencil and paper and they're still creating pieces of writing. So I generally will get a lot of products from my students. It's a matter of how am I going to pull things like observations and conversations. So the first is making look for lists. So this is where I'm looking at a week at a glance. So when I'm doing my planning out on Sundays, I will often pick out key expectations of things that I'm looking for. And it might simply be for math this week. My look for list is whether or not students can measure in millimeters, centimeters, decimeters, and meters, and whether or not they can convert between meters and centimeters. And they should be able to use the decimal, their understanding of the decimal place value system to help them with that conversion piece. So I'm specifically looking for whether or not can they measure things using a variety of units of measurement, and can they convert between meters and centimeters? Those are the two look fors I'm looking for. So I will use a class list, and I will have two columns on a half-page class list, and one will say measuring using a variety of units, and the other will indicate that I want them to be able to convert. Throughout my week, as I'm doing whole group, small group, and as well as, independent work that I'm able to circulate around my classroom, the look fors I'm looking for is whether or not a student is competently able to measure things with a variety of units and whether or not they are going to be able to convert those. And I will be looking whether or not that's going to be an observation of whether I can see them measuring things accurately or whether it's going to be a conversation. I will use these through whole group and small group instruction. Now on my class list, it's just I have a code that I use. It's a symbolic code that I use, but you can simply use a 1, 2, 3, or 4 to identify that they're struggling, which would be a 1. A 2 would be they're close to getting it, but they're still making some errors and need a bit of support. A 3 is there's a competent understanding, and 4, they have a solid understanding. And that I will use that information to also help decide what I will be working on later in the week for guided instruction, as well as for some next week lessons if I have a few groups of students that might need some extra reinforcement of those skills. So I will use those in math and social studies as well as in language, and I call them my look for lists. And it's just a quick check mark that I have a class list, and I give myself not a day to do it because that's realistically I'm not going to get to every kid in my class. but I'll go with a week or 2 weeks, whether I'm looking for those specific skill sets or those specific expectations of things that I want to track. Do they get it? Don't they get it? Can I move on, or do I have to repeat? And that's a lot of my assessment for learning, whether or not we're ready to move on. I will use that for my observations. Another thing that I am doing for being able to gather some of these observations and conversations is I am utilizing and harnessing some of the technology that we have in our classroom. So I have my own devices, whether it's my computer or my Apple iPad, and I will use the tech devices to allow me to capture some of those observations. And that could be a case of whether I'm taking photos of student work, I'm taking video of student work samples, or students completing a task where I don't have to be marking it right on the spot, but I can go back and reflect on that video and make my notes afterwards. So sometimes I will have the ability to capture the learning as it's happening. Now, realistically, I can't be at the same place at the same time, and I can't see all of my students doing their work. So sometimes I can get students to capture the observations of them working and then share that with me. And it still allows me to have a visual ability to have an observation of what they're doing without actually having to be there physically observing it. So I can get my students to capture their own learning. It's less of a product because they're not really producing anything tangible other than a video, but it allows me to see what they're using. So I can utilize apps such as Explain Everything, or simply just the native apps that are on an iPad device, such as the camera, note-taking, Notability, or the ability to just record and take pictures, and then share those to me through either creating a slide to show their learning, or as well as just uploading the video to Google Classroom. A new app that I am probably going to try, because I've been hearing a lot about online, is called Flipgrid. And this allows you to pose a question to students and they respond through almost like a selfie video to your question. And I think that's an interesting opportunity for students to quickly share their thoughts and their opinions through just a auditory and visual message. So I can observe them and hear their thinking, but it's not necessarily a written output. So it gives me a different way to do it. Apparently, my notifications make my dog worry about the fact that the doorbell is ringing. So excuse the background dog barking. So I can use the tech. So then when I use the tech, I can capture some of that more learning. Now, Kim, you asked a great question. So when do you have the time to watch all of that? It would be the same amount of time that I would use to be marking, say, a worksheet that they would be doing. I actually find, because it's all on a device, I will find time between dropping kids off, working, because I'm using Google Classroom. I find it actually a lot easier to mark because I'm not hauling all of these things home with me. There is still going to be marking with that. Sometimes it's not necessarily a full mark. Sometimes it's just informing my instruction, and I'll collect it and use it if I need to. But you still have to have all of that marking pieces. It's just a different way that students can kind of share their learning with you. It allows you to have a kind of a conversation that doesn't necessarily have to happen live and in person. And they're not always producing a written output, which is often what you're getting with a product. And I have a variety of students in my classroom that don't perform as well on a written output as they do through visual representations of their learning or verbal representations of their learning. So I definitely have to have all three pieces included in my assessment so that I can hit students at their various strengths, so that I can capture valid assessment pieces of information. So I find actually listening to the auditory is actually quicker than, say, reading. And that's just me too. I absorb information much more through auditory than through reading. So I find that myself works better. So I will use the assistive tech to sometimes capture their learning, especially in math, if I want them to show me how they can model something, or if they can't necessarily explain their thinking really well, but I need there to be more information for, say, communication, and I want to see their thinking processes, which they're not necessarily doing a bang-up job all the time at showing me through pencil and paper tasks, then recording what they're able to do gives me a much better picture of what that is. The other piece that I do often, which cuts down on some of the marking and still allows me to have those observations and conversations, is small group instruction. So because I have a small group in front of me, it allows me to see them and see what they're doing, as well as talk to them about how they're working through their process. And I will have, again, a look for list, or even a little box with their name in it with just a blank box on a paper. So I'll have 20 kids in my class, and I will have 10 students on the front and 10 students on the back of the page, where I just have an open box where I can write notes. So when the paper is filled, it means I've seen all of those students, and I will make notes as they come to see me in a small group. After I've seen that group, I'll quickly make notes on what it is that they were still struggling with, what they need to work next on, and I will do that kind of in the moment. Doing more small group instruction definitely cuts down on my marking time at home or during my prep, but it's certainly still there. There's still marking that you have to do. It's just getting creative at how you can look at gathering evidence of learning in more ways than simply collecting a pencil and paper product that's based on written output. You also want to be able to collect information through observations as well as conversations with your students throughout this assessment, most often assessment for learning, and also as well as assessment of learning. So those are kind of my 3 tips for how I can gather more observations and conversations for my students, is using some look for lists, which are just quick checklists, using a lot of technology to leverage some of the power within those tech devices to allow students different opportunities to express their thoughts and their thinking and their abilities through different means, as well as gathering more opportunities for small group learning so that I have more focused time with individual students, so that I have a better opportunity to observe and talk with them about some of their strengths and areas of need in different subject areas that I'm working with. So I said I was going to try to be a bit more brief today about that, so we're going to keep focused on just focusing on the triangulation of data for today. I am going to be coming back next week, and we're going to talk a little bit more about assessment, as well as we're going to continue this month talking about assessment, talking about rubrics, tracking all of those things. And if you've got any questions leading to assessment that you would like addressed in the month of November, please feel free to either send me a message, an email, or leave a comment on this video below and let me know what questions you might have about assessment that you would like me to address in an upcoming video. So thank you so much for watching, and I can't wait to continue this conversation throughout all of the various ways that we get to interact with one another. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week as we continue to talk more about assessment and using that in your 21st century classroom. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll talk to you next week. Bye for now.